Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Spotlight on Security Tech Insights. I am really excited about our topic today. We are going to be diving in to generative AI, talking about security, safety, governance, making sure that your organization, as you embark on the generative AI journey, has the right tools in place with the right access controls to ensure you're going to get what you need. My name is Theresa Miller. I am the Director of Technical Advocacy here at Cohesity. And today I'm joined by an expert in this space. Can you introduce yourself?
Thanks a lot, Theresa. My name is Greg Statton. I work in our office of the CTO, responsible for AI and data here at Cohesity. So, Theresa, you've been to a lot of trade shows throughout the year. I'm sure as a lot of the listeners have been as well. And I'm sure there's been kind of a very common theme across all of them. I'm sure a lot of them or all of them have been talking a lot about the impacts of generative AI, both the kind of the good and maybe some of the bad. Across all of them, what are some of the common themes or takeaways that you've pulled across all of these that might concern the enterprise?
Yeah, so the first observation I've made is that earlier in the year, we were hearing less about this, maybe a little more chatter, but as we came into the end of the year, AI was a pretty constant topic across these events. Now, in terms of what was top of mind, I noticed that there's a lot of observing going on, not a lot of active projects yet, but you're seeing the enterprise practitioners as well as even the execs paying attention and looking at safety, security, and governance of data. Those really seem to be the top three. Because when you think about how you're using natural language to manage this data, you really have to make sure that it is secured and only the people who should have access to it should. And then there's this whole safety topic. But Greg, I know you have a lot of ideas around this. Can we hear what you're also seeing and experiencing from the conversations you're having?
Yeah, no, and those are great themes that you're pulling away from there, and I think those are all top of mind across everybody. And I'm in a unique position where I'm working kind of on our core AI, ML, and Gen AI strategies here, but I also spend a lot of time talking to customers and prospects in this space. And what's interesting is I'll ask every single one of them kind of the same couple of questions when I join into these conversations, and I always ask, hey, do you have any initiatives from kind of the most senior of leadership to start bringing in generative AI in your organization? And without fail, every single one of them say yes. Our CTO, CIO, CDO, you name it, CXO says it's very important. We need to start looking at ways to bring generative AI in. So just like you had said, there's a lot of talk about it. It almost reminds me of like the beginnings of cloud computing, where everybody was like, this is a really interesting thing. I want to do it. I don't know how. And a lot of them are really kind of stuck on the how do I bring my enterprise data that's kind of like our prized possession to these generative AI models, not only in a way that's like efficient from a space, number of copies perspective, but how can I ensure that I don't end up in the headlines as another company who's had data leak out of one of these core foundational models? And so they are kind of stuck in this. What can I do to satisfy my boss's boss and bring this in, because I want to be able to bring it in too. And how do I stay off the front pages of the latest news feeds? And so there's a lot of trying to figure out what to do, and then you kind of couple that with what we've been seeing in the industry and this rapid pace of innovation. Like I've been in this industry for a little while now, and I cannot remember a time where we've seen this pace of innovation just take the whole industry by storm. And so they're also kind of stuck thinking, well, how do I stay on top of all this? So it's a really interesting landscape out there for the enterprise.
I agree. One of the other things that, as you were sharing your thoughts, that came to mind for me too, is that we're seeing more and more organizations not only look for solutions with a generative AI component, but they're actually looking to build some of their own. And when you think about that from a security perspective, having your own internal systems that have some of that integrated and doing some of your own development, I think is just an interesting thing to keep in mind during our conversation today. So I have another question for you, Greg. So in terms of deployment, what are some of the enterprise challenges around deploying and using AI?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So, we drew, or at least I drew a little bit of a parallel earlier with kind of the emergence of cloud computing. And there was a term that kind of came out that I'm sure we all remember from then. It was the shadow IT, where you had folks that said, hey, I can go to Amazon, I can just put my credit card in, and I can get that virtual machine, I can get that workload, I can get that database spun up like that. Whereas if I go to my internal infrastructure services, it may take a week to provision that image. Well, it's a lot easier to go that way. And I think, we're seeing a lot of parallels in this space. And I've been seeing the emergence of shadow AI in these organizations say, hey, you know what? I can go give a credit card to OpenAI and I can get an API key and I can start, downloading an application off GitHub, or I can start building my own, or I can go to a SaaS provider and put my API key in and I can start using it. And yeah, it is that simple. There's a ton of tools out there that can really improve your overall kind of quality of life in day-to-day operations. But you got to step back and say, like, is this safe for me to do with my data? And so I think if you zoom out for a minute, some of the core challenges is, first and foremost, I always tell organizations that generative AI is not just going to impact IT and or applications. It cuts cross-functionally across an entire enterprise. So I really think first and foremost, these enterprises need to build cross-functional committees that can help govern access and procedures and policies around AI, ML, and generative AI internally. And once you get all the key stakeholders together, you can start talking about, classifications of data, types of applications, and types of use cases that you want to be able to develop to help bring into the organization. And so once you've kind of got your cross-functional committee, I think one of the next biggest challenges is these AI models are just kind of Fisher-Price toys to a better extent without data. And so that data is really kind of key or paramount to these strategies and initiatives. So then you have to go out and find where all of your data exists, all over your enterprise sprawl. It needs to be kind of consolidated, and it needs to be deduplicated. And you need to identify which copy of that particular file is the right one to use. And then now once you have that data, and it's the kind of the single source of truth and the good copy of that piece of data, you need to then start figuring out, well, should this be allowed to be used externally with models, or should this not? And then if it is to be accessed, what sort of kind of governance do I need to apply to this? Who in my organization should be allowed to access this? And so building out a lot of these frameworks and procedures and policies at a cross-functional level will make all of this go a lot smoother. And I think one of the hardest things I mentioned earlier in this is just the rapid pace of innovation. I mean, these are the weeks where decades are made. It seems like every week there's a new app, a new innovation, new research paper that's come up, that I sit and spend hours reading and digesting and understanding to see what the impacts are going to be. And just that pace of change can distract you from your kind of core mission. And so understanding your core use cases, kind of going back to first principles of your business, identify your key use cases that you feel like are going to help you reduce your overall time to action, increasing your productivity, and focusing there. Which that's a lot to consider, I think, Theresa. Wouldn't you think?
I agree. So a few things really resonated with me. So when you called this out as almost like what we went through from a cloud perspective, I think organizations should quickly think about what they could have done differently to prevent some of the the unexpected use cases, we'll call them, where you're buying and paying on your own card. I think there could be some value in maybe shutting down some of those sites, and maybe just having an approval process to prevent that sprawl. And then I think really the other piece that I thought was really, really interesting is just work with the business, like you were saying. Let's, get some committees built to figure out how to use it. And then that way you can educate the users, and you can probably unlock those sites, let people dive in. But it has to be done with awareness and education to ensure that it's deployed properly within the org.
No, I couldn't agree with you more around that education. Educating people on the good and the bad of generative AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning is extremely beneficial. Like, I kind of demystifying that magic box in the internet will really help. I think if organizations take kind of the iron fist approach and just shut everything down and say, nope, we're not going to do anything like this, humans tend to be pretty resilient. They'll figure out ways to kind of get access to the tools to help make their lives easier. We're all pretty lazy, and if we can see a shorter path to doing something, we're going to figure out a way to take it. Whether this be on their own personal devices, and then there's a whole host of other kind of like security concerns when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Theresa, talking about security concerns, what do you think? Spending time in the security world and in your day to day here at Cohesity, what security considerations should enterprises be taking or kind of thinking about? Both from like the cybersecurity, organization or function, how can they benefit from this? But then also like just the overall concerns.
Yeah. So I do think that there should be proper access controls in place. Like if you just talk about the day-to-day, right? Not everyone should have access to all of AI. It should be use case specific. Tying back to the education, I mean, you definitely want to empower users to use it. AI can build efficiencies into your workday. So there's absolute value in using it. But when we're thinking about security and the potential bad side of things, one of the areas that I think organizations are going to kind of have to heighten from an external threat perspective is their email. Their ability to identify AI generated emails. Another one I'm seeing is the QR codes. And I think some of that's coming out of the AI side as well, where you're now getting emails with threats that are so spot on from a language perspective because AI can write it and it can translate it. So if I want a German email, I start in English and tell AI to convert it, it's proving to be pretty accurate. And so where we used to be able to catch like the spelling mistakes and whatnot, that is going to be harder. And also keep in mind, over like 90% of malicious attempts on your data start with email. So we really have to elevate our security there. Now, the other side of this is the bots and malware that are also being generated by AI. So I think it's unfortunately making attacks on our data easier. And so we need to make sure we have the right external controls in place to prevent that stuff from getting in and getting at our data. Now, of course, we work at Cohesity, so we're fully prepared for the recovery conversation. You should always, worst case scenario, have the ability to recover, but that's not what our conversation really is about today. But I did want to call that out because AI is changing that cyber attack landscape. And so we really need to think again how we're protecting from the outside. So that was kind of a summary of what I think, internally as well as externally. Is there anything you'd want to add, Greg, to that you're seeing and hearing?
No, it's funny because like I'm the fatal optimist when it comes to pretty much everything. And when I look at these tools and I look at the cybersecurity landscape or kind of the cyber threat landscape, it's these individual enterprises that have to combat against these, state-sponsored organizations or vast networks of organizations, these vast teams of people. And the enterprise security teams are outnumbered 10 to 1, 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1, depending on how large these other nation states or bad actor kind of virtual organizations are. You do need these tools can help the enterprise combat against these in the same way that they're being leveraged against the organizations. So I think being able to leverage generative AI with your cybersecurity tooling and tool work is going to be massively beneficial. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we started researching internally was how generative AI was being consumed in cybersecurity startups and new companies that were forming out there. And one of the key threads that we saw weaving through all of them was helping organizations kind of reduce that knowledge gap through generative AI. You said something really powerful earlier, that generative AI allows the bad actors to be able to take an email or a phrase or a corpus of text and translate it natively into any other language, and it's perfectly translated. Context carries through, because that's what these models were originally kind of invented to be able to translate, and that's what they were really good at, generating a net new token output based upon the input. Now, if you look at language kind of differently and say that you have like an engineering English and then regular English, there are terms, vernacular understandings within a technical kind of vertical that kind of can go very deep, and it takes a lot of time to build mastery within that stack. And if we're talking about cybersecurity or a particular tooling or framework, it takes a while to master that. Now, if you're trying to onboard a lot of cybersecurity professionals into an organization to help combat these large bad actor states, generative AI tools can help bridge that gap where these individuals can come in, use their natural language, their own vernacular, and be able to accomplish tasks at a much deeper understanding, because these tools can help do that translation. So I think being able to ramp people faster, consume these services a lot more efficiently. And there's this dawn of the autonomous AI agent, which can then self-reason and self-act autonomously based upon kind of a set of rules that are defined by the security professional, I think are the only tools that are going to help us combat against this next wave of cyber threats.
I think that's really interesting. I think the learning part you keyed in on in that response as well. I think I'm not totally sure how accuracy of data and in the AI applies to security, but I think to a certain degree it might. And if nothing else, it's just another thing we could maybe talk about, right? Because
Absolutely.
AI, when you do a search, even like let's just say I went out to Bing and tried using some of the AI, I might not get the right response. So there is a learning piece, and you're right, it's going to take time to ramp. So I think that somehow translates to how we're going to stay ahead of the cyber attacks and threats, right? In time and theory, that should get better.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, and it kind of all comes down to how these tools are built. Being able to use a model plus external data sources to be able to allow the model to interact with these external data sources. It would be like me going to this artificial human that knows English, in my case, really, really well. But then I have this vast library of data. Well, I don't have time to go read everything in there, but I confront it with an interface that's able to semantically find anything that's similar to what I'm talking about, pull out that stack of research, provide my question with that stack of research off to the artificial human, and I get a response. And that vast research could be anything. It could be, the docs of a particular product. It could be a whole like NIST framework. It could be, the latest news on latest zero-day malware that's affecting systems. So all of this can be combined and used to really help cybersecurity organizations to reduce their overall time to action.
Awesome. All right. So let's talk about recommendations for organizations in terms of how they can get started successfully with AI.
Yeah. No, and this
Right?
is this is a fun one. I was just talking to somebody the other day about this, and they had said, how would you recommend an enterprise to spend their money in generative AI? I said, well, they should spend it all with us. Take all of the money possible and just give us the money. And I said, no, in all seriousness, I think enterprises can get lost in the hype cycle that we're seeing in this. And they'll read any trade rag that's talking about a new vendor or a new technology or new innovation, and it'll sound super appealing and exciting, and they'll go cut POs to buy, any number of quantities of that. But I think you got to take a step back and tackle this problem from the other way. Don't look at the necessarily the net new shiny workload or company or activity out there. Look at the problems that you're tackling in your organization. Look at areas that are taking a long time to accomplish. Figure out within those kind of day-to-day functional workflows or work streams of a particular function, find out those things that take the longest amount of time. And those are likely areas that you can sit and optimize. Like for instance, when we were talking with kind of compliance and internal audit organizations, we found out that the longest amount of time spent in an internal audit was sifting through and filtering through the payload of data that was delivered to them when they said, hey, there's an inquiry that's come in across this timeline, go investigate. That investigative payload is massive because IT doesn't want to get blamed for not giving the right data. So they'll overestimate, overshoot the payload and deliver it. These are people hours and tool hours that are spent to dig through that pile of data. So we went out and solved this problem with pairing generative AI capabilities, search and discover capabilities with that data itself to help reduce that overall time to action. So I think you need to go and find those use cases that help reduce that time to action. I think another great use case, we talked about compliance just there, has support and knowledge management. When you're bringing on a lot of new people in your company, your organization, again, it takes them a long time to ramp. If you can have all those work processes, procedures, internal documentations in a chat-like experience for them, they're going to be able to get their questions answered and they're not going to have to read through tons of documentation to get there. You're going to be able to get them their answer, and they're going to be able to move on. And I think we talked a lot about kind of this cross-functional committee. I think that is the number one key to success. If you can get all your stakeholders across the company, on the same page with what problems you want to solve, you're going to be able to move faster. I think there's going to be a lot of talk about who owns this in this space, because this is all brand new. Should it be the CTO? Should it be the CIO organization? Should this live in compliance and audit under the CFO? And I think we're starting to see the emergence of the chief data officer or the chief data and analytics stroke AI officer, where they can be responsible for how the data is leveraged. And once you find kind of that single-threaded owner, you're going to be able to get traction in this.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thought for our listeners today. When I think about data, and historically, data has been owned by just like your backup teams or maybe your infrastructure team. And I don't know that there's always a lot of great insights into data. So I think that AI has the power to not only give visibility to those technical teams, but it does give you, like you were saying, the ability to almost up-level that, just because of the simplicity it brings to the table in terms of how it works using natural language. But you just don't have to be super technical to get the details. Plus now you have the AI power to get it at a more expedited rate to save time.
Yeah.
So just kind of to reiterate some of it, agree with some of what you said, but also just add another element or thought to it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
All right. So we are just about out of time. So Greg, in terms of today, do you have just like a top key takeaway for our audience listening in?
Yeah, no, so first and foremost, AI, generative AI chatbots, they're not coming for your job. I think if anything, it makes the knowledge worker even more valuable. I think if one thing that you could take away from this is the model itself, that foundational model that everybody's talking about, that's not as nearly as important as the data. The models are only going to be able to provide insights on the data that it's provided. And that data gets created by people who understand the organization, understand the application, understand the industry. So really, it's not coming for your job. You need to focus on a very solid data strategy. You need to understand what data you have, what data you need to get rid of, how many copies, because you might have multiple copies of it. You need to be able to provide a responsibility and governance access layer on top of that. Should this data be accessed through artificial intelligence and machine learning and GenAI? And if so, do we need to, make sure there's classifications on this? The whole employee population can access it, or only the executives, or only the legal department, or only HR? You need to kind of set those things in motion before bringing those applications into the space. If you do it in reverse, you're just setting yourself up for a world of pain later.
Awesome. And I think for me, I'm going to go ahead and just add, in terms of a key takeaway, I do think that AI outside of our organizations does have the power to make security a little more challenging. So my recommendation would be to take the time to continue to up your security posture. And I think between all of those things, you've got a really, really great tool you can use. Despite that, right? Despite the fact that we have to up our security posture, I think there's a lot of power. The time efficiencies you mentioned as well, Greg, we're spot on. So, Greg, thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Theresa. It's always a pleasure chatting with you on these.
I agree. I enjoy that we get to do these things often. And thank you to all of our listeners in the audience today. And that wraps up our latest episode of Spotlight on Security Tech Insights.